Hello there, and welcome to my thoughts on the 5th episode of the Halo series. And I'm pleased to say that we finally got a good episode where the Covenant and UNSC actually fight each other. But before getting to the good parts, I'll just briefly go over what happens with Quan this episode. As Soren and Quan are on their way to find a new ship in order to return to the asteroid colony, the motorcycle that they're on breaks down. Since Soren is unable to fix it, he needs to go off and find a new vehicle for them to use, but he doesn't trust Quan, and since Soren wants nothing more to do with the magical rebellion, he handcuffs Quan to the bike so that she can't run off and find the mystics in the desert that her father talked to. This enrages Quan, and as soon as Soren leaves, she begins trying to break out of her restraints. And after a short temper tantrum, she finally manages to break the part of the bike that she's handcuffed to, and lay an ambush for Soren to return. Once Soren finally comes back with the vehicle, she sneaks up and knocks him unconscious, before stealing his gun, and her part of the episode ends with her debating whether or not she should kill Soren. Now moving on to the UNSC side of the episode. It starts off fairly slow, with the research team having set up camp around the artifact. It seems like the real artifact is buried inside of the pillar, and Dr. Halsey is unsure of how to get it out. All the while, Master Chief has been going around trying to figure out the truth behind how he was brought into the Spartan program, and when Cortana can't find any official records on Master Chief or the other Spartans and how they were brought into the UNSC, so he tries talking to Captain Keyes about his past. Keyes lies to Chief and tells him he'll look into it later, and informs Halsey that Master Chief is still trying to investigate his childhood. Once the UNSC finally manages to break the rock surrounding the Forerunner artifact, Master Chief decides to disobey Halsey's orders and touch the artifact, which unlocks the rest of his memories, where he remembers that Dr. Halsey broke into his house and abducted him as a child. Enraged by this revelation, Master Chief attempts to kill Halsey, but Cortana manages to shut him down before he can harm Halsey. Back on Madrigal, the Covenant have finally reached the cave where the first artifact was found, and somehow by just wandering around the cave and touching the rocks, Maquis is able to figure out where the second artifact is, presumably by receiving some sort of vision, but at least the Covenant figuring out where the second artifact is finally allows us to have some action in this series, because suddenly a Covenant Corvette appears in the sky above the UNSC excavation site and begins destroying everything in sight, starting with the ship that brought the UNSC to the planet. This finally gives us our first look at the Jackals and Grunts in this series, and they look amazing. I really liked the wrist energy blades that the Jackals had that they were using to slice apart the Marines. It's at this point that the Spartans are finally given something to do, and begin fending off the Covenant and protecting the Forerunner artifact at all costs. I really loved it seeing the Marine driving the Warthog, and then a Grunt hijacks it from him, only immediately to have the Warthog hijacked back by Master Chief, who then uses the Warthog to bring the artifact back to Halsey, along with the other Spartans. But it's at this point that Spartan Kai begins to be overwhelmed by the horrors of war due to her removal of the emotional palette in her back. It seems like the Covenant are actually going to kill her when Master Chief decides to leave the artifact with the other Spartans and go save her. He jumps off the Warthog right onto a Banshee, and then ends up steering the Banshee into a Phantom, causing it to explode and kill all the Covenant surrounding Kai. But this victory is short-lived, as the Warthog containing the Forerunner artifact is hit and the Spartans end up losing the artifact. As Chief rushes to reclaim the artifact, a Brute is dropped down from a Covenant ship and just swats the Master Chief away. The Brute then claims the artifact and returns to the Covenant ship. There's nothing else that the UNSC can do, as the Covenant now leaves the planet, having claimed the Forerunner artifact for themselves. But before the ship can leave, a drop pod is released containing Maquis, who once again pretends to seek help from the UNSC so that she can lead the Covenant to reach where the first artifact is hidden. Overall, this episode finally shows us the war between the Covenant and the UNSC that we have wanted to see since the beginning of this series. The new members of the Covenant shown here all look amazing, especially the look of the Brute, and the way that the combat was handled felt straight out of the games, with Spartans boarding vehicles and enemies boarding vehicles, and Master Chief constantly switching weapons throughout the fight, including one point where he throws his pistol right into the head of a Grunt. This episode also sets up the fall of Reach, where Maquis will lead the Covenant to Reach, and it seems like this series is setting up the fall of Reach to be the big finale of this season. And I'm assuming that the discovery of Halo will be the big cliffhanger that this season ends on. But those are just my thoughts on this episode of the Halo series. Let me know what you thought in the comments, and consider subscribing if you want to hear more of my thoughts as the series comes out. And until next time, thanks for watching.